Welcome to our podcast on human rights and technology leading organisational change. My name is Mavanwi Warwick and I'm EGM for Regulatory Compliance Global and Executive Sponsor for Rule of Law Initiatives at LexisNexis. Most recently, this involved being part of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project, led by the Human Rights Commission. The final report was tabled in Parliament this year and contained recommendations on how to protect and promote human rights and how responsible innovation methods could be deployed to achieve positive outcomes. You can see the report at tech.humanrights.gov.au. As a quick summary, it looks at how organisations develop and/or use technologies such as AI with a particular focus on recommendations for government decision making and accessibility. I found the project fascinating and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with people from different organisations across government, private sector, academia and civil society to come up with some practical ways the recommendations can be implemented. I'm really interested in hearing practical tips for particular role types like board members, human resources and talent acquisition specialists, product managers and procurement, just to name a few. But I'm going to attempt to anchor all of these multifaceted issues back to what it means for a compliance professional, the people who are responsible for helping their organisation document and action regulatory and legislative frameworks. For this reason, I'm going to ask each of my guests to provide some practical tips on how to make the recommendations a reality. My working theory on this is that organisations that adhere to human rights frameworks will see positive benefits across a wide range of KPIs, including employee, customer, shareholder and financial outcomes. Today, I'm going to start with an area that was given a lot of focus in the report, making technology accessible as an enabling right for people with a disability. Part D of the report covers the different kinds of barriers people with a disability can face when accessing digital communication technologies and how law and policy reform, along with human rights by design strategy, can improve functional accessibility. But before we get into all of that, we're going to go back to basics and look at the overall technology impact on people with disabilities. So I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Murphy, an experienced digital accessibility manager and a fellow member of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project. Thank you so much for joining me today, Sean. Can I start with understanding what it is that defines a disability and the differences between medical and social models?
So a disability basically is someone who falls into different categories. So sensory, mobility, intellectual, cognitive is a general broad category, so you can define them even further. So sensory covers people who are vision impaired, which could be even broken down further to blind and low vision. Hearing impaired is another category they like to break it down to. Someone has hard of hearing or deaf. Mobility be someone who is can't use a keyboard. That's generally one a way of explaining it, or someone who uses a wheelchair and they have some form of mobility problem with their disability. So there's a lot of categories there. Okay. Which are going to, and the other ones, again, you can have people who have dyslexia. That is a form of disability, or people have I call it math dyslexia, but there's a better term out there for it. Someone has neurodiverse and so forth. There's a range of different. The models themselves, there's the three more common models. Is the medical one, which is defined from a regulatory or legislation point of view when you are classified as a disabled person. To use, say, vision impairment, if you're 660 and a certain field range, and I don't remember the field range, then you're legally blind. So, for example, to put into real terms, if I had 10% vision, which is 660, or I would have to see what I would see 60 meters away, I have to be 6 meters away. So in those instances, you're looking at a building 60 meters away, and there's a lot of details you can't get. But when you're 6 meters away with that normal vision, you're going to see a lot more. So someone who has that 6 meter distance, they're going to get the same thing as you 60 meters away. That's the sort of like rule of thumb that I give people.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the social model really, now the problem with the medical model, it's very much black and white.
Yeah.
Now, the social model is looking at the more inclusion, saying a lot of the problems in society is that people who have a disability is caused by society. So
Yeah.
if we keep it really simple, and we can go into more the digital side later, but let's say in the old days, and I'm a young lad, but when the old days when the horse and cart was around, we had gutters, but the gutters didn't have ramps on them, so a person in a wheelchair could go up and down them. So they would introduce it. Now everyone uses it. So if you're a mother with or father with a pram, you're a person on a bike, skateboarding, whatever it is, people use those ramps to get on back up onto the footpath.
Yeah.
And that was, that's a simple adjustment made, but wasn't introduced before because society didn't see the need. And that's how basically, at a really simplistic way, that is basically the social model. It's removing these artificial barriers that have been introduced by organisations to give everyone equivalent access to information, building, education, goods and services, IT, and so on.
Is that I've read some things about the difference between impairment and disability, and maybe you can help me with the kind of terminology I should be using there. So the impairment is the medical condition, but the disability is the social implications for the person with the impairment. Is that correct?
The impairment's more of your... Okay, if we go back in history, we used to have handicap. And that used to be a common term in the 80s. And that's saying this person's deficient or something. When you talk about impaired, it is leaning back to the handicap model approach. This is my view, where and it's trying to be P&C, politically correct. This person has a vision impairment, so their vision has a problem.
Right.
When you talk about disabled, well, humankind is quite good in this space, is to box people into some form of category. So if disabled is, you have no longer have full functionality as what people perceive or society perceive what is norm. So that's why they have the dis. So the reverse to that would be, when you talk to someone who has a vision impairment or who's blind or whatever, you'd say a person with a disability or people with disabilities. So you're focusing on the person first and the disability last. So the disability is not really part of your conversation per se. You recognize it and you acknowledge it, but when you talk and trying to address things or approach people in a social or a meeting or a professional level, you're focusing on the person, and the disability should be considered last.
Okay, so just to go back to your horse and cart example, she's certainly will stay in my mind now. So when I was a young parent with a pram, I was disabled from accessing the footpath because the gutters weren't properly ramped for me to access. It wasn't that there was a problem with me, there was a problem with the gutter.
Correct.
Is that a good... Okay.
So that's really when you start talking about accessibility. Accessibility, there's a barrier there where you're trying to achieve something and someone has put it in front of you, like using the example there, you're a mother on a wheelchair, mother in a pram, trying to go to point A to point B, and you can't because there's an obstacle in your way.
Okay, that makes sense. And can you give us some examples of what that means in the world of technology? And does it mean different things for the different groups of disability that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, well, there are some commonality there and there's some uniqueness. So let's say, well, I'll give you a real life example. I went shopping to renovate my new kitchen.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at stoves tops, and I only can get electrical, all the stove tops were touch. Yes. So if you had artificial hands, If you're blind, if you're low vision, you're an elderly person that your hands are shaking,
Mm.
or you're a person who, and the guy who was building the kitchen said, he can't operate his stovetop. He has to always get his daughter or wife to do it because sometimes it doesn't work for him, and he has
Yeah.
no disability whatsoever. And it basically, I had to, well, in my situation, having a vision impairment, I could not buy a stove that had a touch screen because I tried them and I just could not work them effectively. So I had to go back to a knob version, which I was
Yeah.
lucky to find it. Now, if I'm trying to get the the modern ones, there's
Yeah.
very, very small number. I only found 1 or 2 brands that had one model,
Wow.
and the
And,
direction is going out of there.
and that's got to have flow-on effects too. I mean, coincidentally, I was shopping for a kitchen last year, and one of the benefits of those kinds of touch stoves, and I assume it's to do with the cooking, is that they're very energy efficient, for example. So that's going to have an ongoing positive effect for my energy bills, whereas possibly
Correct.
the stove that you had to buy is going to have continuing negative effects for you just because someone didn't really think about it when they were designing this new kind of cooking implement.
Correct. So, and the purpose of using the kitchen because people can relate to it.
Yeah.
And like my daughter, it's not my daughter, my sister is also visually impaired.
Okay.
She is looking at buying a new stove, and she's probably going to end up buying one of the real old-fashioned solid core ones or something like that. So she's going to have to get a cheap stove that might last 3, 4, 5 years, rather than buy a good quality stove that's going to last 10 or 15. So there is that ongoing impact or onflow impact from an economic point of view. Now, if you go into the more online digital world,
Yeah.
there is very much a range of problems. Now, some people say accessibility is moving in the right direction, and I sort of agree and disagree.
Yeah.
Now, in some areas, some sectors of the Australian market have done a good job. So the 4 banks are doing a good job, and that will probably include St. George into that. So the telco companies are starting that journey, saying some of them are doing a really good job. But once you start moving out of that sort of area, or you go to like a finance, you're lucky enough to have a job and you want to try and improve your financial situation,
Yeah.
or you're elderly and you're starting to have impaired, and you're someone who wants to do you're lucky enough to deal with financial type institution, then that's when it becomes very, very patchy on the level of access you can get to that sort of services. Some online stores out there are very patchy with their level of accessibility. Now, getting back to your original question, this is where it gets very different from some disabilities. So if you're a screen reader user, the impact could be a lot higher than someone who maybe has low, is a what we call in the vision impairment sector a low partially or a very low vision impaired person who they're on the borderline. They still can read large print, and they might be able to use far more websites, and it might be just a slight tweak of the color that they need because they're only magnifying it by 200%. So and likewise, there's other disabilities. So if you're someone who's hearing impaired and they want to use Alexa, deaf, and they use Alexa and they can't speak, well, or they can't hear the thing, then that's a barrier. That's so the companies quickly brought in screens, not necessarily for that community, but because the sighted community wanted it, and they could see they could add extra services, so therefore that community got benefit from it. So that's a technology that sort of like benefits both people, but I from a vision impairment, I do see problems with some of those tools because the technology they include on the screen is pretty primitive, and it doesn't give you the capabilities they need. And if you look at futuristic technology, self-driving cars, which is going to have a huge amount of AI in there. Now, the biggest barrier there I see is if you're visually impaired and for whatever reason that car's driving you somewhere, and let's say you're trying to find a building in the middle of George Street, and the shop's moved 2 stores up. but the map hasn't updated. And so the car gets to, let's say the car's that accurate and gets you outside the front door, the visually impaired person is going to get out of the car,
Yeah.
assuming they can use it in the first place. And they get to the store and there might be the store's no longer there. So the store's no longer there. Situation, they have to try and somehow find it.
Yeah.
The other problem with self-driving cars, will regulation get to the point of saying, if you can't see, you can drive that car? And at this current climate, I say not.
No, and I think that's part of the challenges in the project, was trying to get the great benefits that we can see from technology without letting loose the harms that can also come with. I really like what you're saying as well about companies can get benefits across the range of the population. Even if they start off looking at something that benefits the sighted community, it can benefit other people as well. And I truly, true believer that doing the right thing is also doing the commercially valuable thing. But out of all the, the experience that you've had, if there was one thing that you wanted to say to people about understanding what disability meant for them when they're making products or choosing a technology to use in their organisation, what's one thing you think they could do differently or better?
I never answer things with one. So I'm going to do two.
Great.
So, firstly, there's a $1.9 trillion market out there for the disability people with disability, friends of disability people, or family who have a disabled child. That's your global market value, $1.9 trillion. If companies
Impressive.
do not see that as a marketing opportunity or a commercial opportunity, then we've got a problem. That's a lot of change.
Yeah.
And to tap into that market, you have to make sure your product's accessible, which is getting to what you are asking for. Is the biggest thing I would say to every organization that we have standards out there for accessibility, and there's two of them. There's an ISO standard. I'm not going to rattle them off here because I never can remember the actual acronyms. For the ISO one, it's basically the Australian Procurement Accessibility Standard. Then you've got the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These I call the baseline. It's not the end of the story, but that must be part of your procurement process. You must have specialists who can go and evaluate those products you are bringing on board to ensure what tools and products fulfill those standards. And ideally, so, we are breaking down the barrier of people with disabilities not getting job, because it's around about 50 to 60% of the disability community don't have job. And one of the problems is the tools and the software you have to use. That's not the only problem. And by doing that, you're going to help the whole. You're going to make more people be able to access technology, and it's good business practice. That's really, end of the day, it's good business practice, and it's an ethical thing to do.
Okay, well, those are both very helpful. I would certainly like to have $1 trillion revenue growth achievement in my CV. So definitely we'll be thinking about that. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for your time today.